One murder, two notes, and a killer hiding in plain sight. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're listening from. Hearing from you makes this all the more special. Now, the mystery unfolds. The afternoon sun filtered gently through the tall, swaying branches of the old willow tree that stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead's village green. Its long, trailing leaves made a green curtain, swishing lightly in the warm breeze, and the air was filled with the mingled scents of grass and late summer flowers. From the nearby church, the soft toll of the bell announced 4 o'clock, and the villagers, having finished their errands, drifted toward the vicarage garden for the annual charity tea. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a wide-brimmed hat adorned with faded silk roses, was holding court near the tea urn, speaking animatedly to Colonel Melchett about the raffle prizes. On the far lawn, children darted between tables, their laughter mingling with the clink of china cups. The event was proceeding exactly as it always had. Pleasant, predictable, and a little gossipy. Miss Marple, in a pale lavender dress and a straw hat with a modest ribbon, sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the shade, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She had already noticed, without the slightest effort, who had arrived together, who had studiously avoided sitting next to whom, and whose smiles masked irritation. It was a habit as natural to her as breathing, though she would have told anyone that she merely liked to observe the little things. The peace was broken by a shrill cry from behind the willow tree. For a brief moment, the crowd froze, cups held midair. Then Mrs. Price Ridley, her face pale as milk, stumbled into view, clutching her handbag as though it were a lifeline. There's someone," she stammered, her voice catching. "Under the willow." The colonel, already halfway across the lawn, pushed through the gathered onlookers, followed by Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting her knitting neatly on the chair, and made her way forward with the calm deliberation of one who has seen many sudden upsets in her time. Beneath the sweeping green canopy lay the body of a man, sprawled awkwardly against the roots. His face was unnaturally still, the eyes half open as if caught in surprise. A thin rivulet of dried blood marked his temple, matted against graying hair. The scent of crushed grass and something metallic hung in the air. "It's Harold Fletcher," Dr. Haydock murmured, kneeling to check for any sign of life, though the stiffness of the limbs made the effort brief. "Dead. Been for some hours, I'd say." The name rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. Harold Fletcher was no stranger to St. Mary Mead, though his appearances were infrequent. A retired solicitor with a reputation for being both meticulous and merciless. He had purchased the old dower house the previous year, and though polite enough, he had not endeared himself to many. Rumors had suggested quarrels over property lines, unpaid debts from years past, and one particularly bitter dispute involving a family will. Colonel Melchett straightened, his face grim. "We'll need the police here at once. No one is to leave the grounds." Miss Marple, still standing a short distance away, allowed her eyes to drift from the body to the scuffed earth near the tree, then to the faint indentation in the grass where someone might have stood watching. Her expression was one of mild concern, as though she were contemplating whether the weather would hold for the rest of the afternoon. But inwardly, she was already thinking of Harold Fletcher's sharp eyes, his habit of lingering in conversations until the other party slipped, and the curious fact that the willow tree stood exactly where one could overhear much without being seen. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice whispered, "Murder!" and the words seemed to hang in the summer air, as heavy as the scent of the flowers. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten on the chair, the needles cooling in the shade. The charity tea had become something far more tangled than anyone had anticipated. A hush settled with the efficiency of a dropped veil, even the children instinctively drawing back from the willows trailing green. Griselda, her voice steadier than her pale cheek suggested, gathered the little ones to the far end of the lawn and spoke to them in that cheerful tone which adults use when the world has shifted and they are determined to pretend it has not. Colonel Melchett sent a young constable, summoned by a runner from the post office, to the garden gate to keep it latched, and posted another at the side lane that led behind the church. The urn continued to breathe out its faint cloud of steam, unattended, as though tea might yet restore what had been taken away. Dr. Haydock, practical as ever, took note of the stiffness in Harold Fletcher's fingers and the gray cast about his mouth. "Hours, yes," he said in a low voice for Melchett's ear. "More than 2, less than 6. The blow looks clean, blunt instrument, not jagged. See the shape? Roundish, not a brick. He didn't crawl here to die. He was placed." "That tree hides half the world?" grunted Melchett, following the doctor's glance to where the willow skirts swept the turf. "But moving a body at any hour is a risk. Why here?" "To be found," said Miss Marple almost apologetically. "It is a place that draws the eye at a village affair. Children pop behind it in games. Ladies look for shade. Men slip there for a quiet cigarette. A body here would never remain private for long." Inspector Slack's arrival confirmed the passage of time. One could almost measure the minutes by the way faces brightened at the sight of competence. Slack was broad-shouldered and brisk, with a manner like a broom. He cleared spaces without asking if they were occupied. "Right," he said sharply, clapping his hands once. "No one leaves. We'll have names and statements. You, madam." He indicated Mrs. Price Ridley. "You say you found him. You will be first." Mrs. Price Ridley dabbed her face with a lace-edged handkerchief. "I went to... well, one prefers not to say. But the facilities in the church hall are nearer from that side, and I thought..." "The shortest path," supplied Miss Marple kindly, as though relieving the poor woman of a social burden. "And you went by the willow to avoid crossing in front of the croquet hoops. I have often done so myself, in less crowded moments." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded gratefully. "Exactly so. And there he was. I confess I shrieked. One does, I suppose, though I'm not a fainting sort of woman. I've always been robust. He looked as if he'd been dead for some time, if I may say so." "You may," said Slack. "Did you touch anything? The body? Anything nearby?" "Certainly not." Her mouth firmed as if virtue itself depended on clean gloves. I stepped back at once. Miss Marple's gaze rested not on the body, but on the grass immediately to its right, where the sun had not yet burnt away the morning dew entirely. There, beneath the fringe of willow leaves, a slight darkening traced an irregular arc. Something dragged, then lifted, and just beyond it, separated by a hand span, the delicate oval of a heel impression. The heel had a small bite out of one corner, forming a neat V. It is extraordinary, Miss Marple reflected, how shoes, like faces, tell their own little stories. And just as some people never see a face properly, so many never look down. "Inspector," called Colonel Melchett. "There's a watch." Slack bent, teased the chain from the dead man's waistcoat pocket, and registered the cracked glass with a grunt. The hands had stopped in a small, precise catastrophe at 10 minutes past 12. "Noon, or near enough," he said. "Lunch hour for some, not for all." "Watches get broken after a struggle," Dr. Haydock observed. "Or in moving. But this looks like the blow did it. Shock to the case. See the dent?" Miss Marple did see and thought too of the vicarage's own arrangements. Griselda had set tea for 4, the church bell had tolled at 4, the watch said 12:10. A space of nearly 4 hours. One could do much in 4 hours, think better of a rash act, or double down upon it. One could also arrange to be very publicly elsewhere. The vicar, Leonard Clement, whose mild face wore the professional sorrow a clergyman keeps for such occasions, came forward with an apology for the presence of so many in his garden. "We had the tent stakes set this morning," he said, indicating the canvas awnings that flapped gently over the trestle tables. "And the mallet has gone missing. It is absurd to mention it in this context, but it is not where it should be." Slack's head turned, sharp as a dog's at the rustle in a hedge. "A mallet?" "For the stakes," the vicar explained, rubbing his brow. "A stout wooden thing, brown handle. It disappears most years and turns up in the coal shed the next day. But—" He stopped, aware suddenly of the weight of his words. Slack's eyes dropped to the rounded bruising at the temple, to the imagined arc of a swing. "We'll search the sheds," he said, "and the grass for traces." "Allow me," murmured Miss Marple, and her blue eyes grew dreamy, which meant, to those who knew her, that they had turned to the keenest points. "I remember Cousin Florence's husband, so clumsy with tools. He left green stains on his cuffs when he knocked pegs into the lawn because the mallet had been painted that dreadful parish green to match the benches. If one were to use such a thing in a hurry and return it less carefully, it would mark." "Paint?" Slack stooped nearer to the dead man's sleeve and frowned. There, near the cuff, was the faintest bloom of dull green. He looked almost affronted. "You've a good eye, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all," she said, flustered. "One remembers little domestic tragedies. It is astonishing what a dab of parish green will attach itself to. Gloves, kerchiefs, even a babysitter's pinafore in one case." Slack signaled to Sergeant Lake. "Check the sheds and look for a mallet with fresh marks. And find out who had charge of the tent equipment. Vicar, a list, if you please." The list, produced with commendable speed by Griselda, contained the usual names. Lionel Peake, the carpenter, who had brought his own tools to help. Oswald Trent, the church warden, a careful man who recorded everything in a little pocketbook. And Irene West, the schoolmistress, who had organized the children's games and had been seen tying buntings to the awning poles. Their names hung for a moment in the collective air and then, like motes, drifted toward the fertile soil of suspicion. "Irene?" said Mrs. Bantry, her voice lowered, but not to the degree she believed it was. "She had that business with her aunt's will last year, did she not? And Mr. Fletcher was connected, being a solicitor. They said he found an irregularity," contributed Mrs. Price Ridley with the prim relish of one who had managed not to remark upon it for some months, and now could, with conscience, say she had not started the topic. "And naturally, if one must be strict about such things, one must." But it left poor Miss West quite in the lurch. She had expected something comfortable, and instead she has only her salary and a very cold little flat over the old dairy. Miss Marple remembered the aunt, a formidable woman who had kept geraniums in winter and opinions in all seasons. She also remembered seeing Irene West last Thursday, standing outside the Dower House, speaking with Harold Fletcher in a tone that had not matched her usual sweetness with the children. The voice had been controlled, the words few, but the set of her mouth had been that of a person who has accepted a blow and is measuring the next step. It is the small adjustments one notices. The way a hand tightens on a reticule, the brief close of the eyes as if against a bright light, that tell one quite enough about what lies inside. Slack took statements. Lionel Peake, solid and sawdust-scented, explained that he had been in the church hall all morning mending a wobbly table. Oswald Trent produced his little book and the satisfaction of a man whose alibi comes bound in neat lines. 11:45 to 12:30, in the vestry with the vicar, counting the offertory from last Sunday and noting disbursements. The vicar confirmed this, mildly distressed to be useful in such a way. Irene West said, in her clear schoolroom voice, that she had been arranging the bunting along the north hedge around noon. The children had helped her, and that she had not seen Mr. Fletcher at all that day. The children, procurable witnesses but unreliable in detail, chirruped that there had been bunting and a hedgehog and a biscuit, and that Miss West had tied knots very fast. "And Mr. Fletcher himself," said Slack, turning to the circle at large. "Was he seen this morning?" A murmur went through the gathering. "Just before 11, offered Mr. Trent, pleased to be exact. "I saw him outside the post office speaking to Mr. Cudworth about a parcel. He did not look pleased." "Mr. Cudworth never pleases anyone if it involves paying extra," put in Griselda gently. "Was it a heavy parcel?" "Wrapped like a book," said Trent. "Long, narrow." "A ledger," Miss Marple said to herself, not aloud. Solicitors loved long, narrow books, or a box that pretended to be one. Sergeant Lake returned with the mallet. It was parish green indeed, with a smear of something cleaner along one side where somebody had lately wiped it. Slack sniffed it as if it might confess. "Who wiped this?" he demanded. "Everything gets wiped in the church hall," Lionel Peake protested with injured virtue. "Grease, paint, jam. One keeps the tools respectable." "There is a difference," Slack said, "between respectable and recently scrubbed." He fitted the mallet's rounded head into the air above the dead man's temple, not touching, but indicating. "This will be tested." Miss Marple's eyes had gone again to the ground. The heel impression with the small V still lay where it had been, a little less distinct now that the sun had crept across the grass. She let her gaze drift upward, as if idly surveying hats, and found Irene West's shoes by chance. They were sensible brown shoes, well polished and unremarkable. The heels were plain, without nicks. Mrs. Price Ridley's were neat too, and new, though too tight if one read the way she shifted her weight. Lionel Peake's boots had their own story. They were thick-soled and square, with nails that left square prints, not ovals. Oswald Trent's shoes were clean to an absurdity. Miss Marple tucked away the heel with the V and kept her count. "It is always odd," she murmured to Dr. Haydock, who had drifted near, "how very quickly a village produces a reason. Irene with her inheritance, Mr. Peake with a bill perhaps, Mr. Trent with a pathway boundary. One must not forget Mr. Fletcher provided reasons for others too." Haydock glanced at her sideways. "You've someone in mind?" "No," said Miss Marple serenely. "Only a habit of observing small pains. People show you where they have rubbed themselves sore, even when they do not intend it." Slack, who did not like mysteries to remain mysterious longer than necessary, announced with a judicious firmness that they would, for the moment, consider the obvious course. Mr. Fletcher, last seen around 11, dead by 12:10 or thereabouts. Discovered at 4, had been killed by a blow from a blunt instrument similar to the parish mallet, and placed under the willow to be discovered at a convenient public juncture. Those who had access to the tent equipment would be examined closely, and those who had cause to resent Mr. Fletcher's professional activities would be questioned at length. "Elementary," muttered Melchett, not without irony. And yet, agreed Miss Marple. because she considered that agreement greased the gears of investigation nicely. There was a small disturbance among the children then, a ripple of excitement where Griselda had kept them in orderly ranks. A little girl with red ribbons darted free and ran, triumphant, toward the willow, her fist clenched around something. "I found a prize," she cried, breathless. "By the hedgehog hole." "Come back, darling," Griselda called quickly. But the child had already arrived within the boundary Slack had drawn. Sergeant Lake met her with the deftness of a man used to lambs springing gaps, knelt, and opened the little fist. Inside lay a strip of paper, torn raggedly along one edge. It was a raffle ticket stub, the part one keeps. Number 147. On the back, in a tidy, legal hand, was written, 4 o'clock, Willow. Griselda made a small sound, as if the day had at last been perfectly described. Slack took the slip between finger and thumb, holding it so it would not bend. "Who wrote this?" "Mr. Trent?" Mr. Trent peered. "That is Mr. Fletcher's hand," he said after a moment, surprised into certainty. "He wrote the labels on the donation envelopes. One could not mistake the way he makes his W." Miss Marple looked at the W as if it were a mouth that had spoken unwisely. It was neat, precise, and entirely in character. A methodical man would arrange his life and, if necessary, his death, with dates and times neatly penciled in. But methodical men did not usually invite their own murders, and they did not generally allow their watches to be broken at 12:10 if they expected to be under a willow at 4. "Inspector," she said very gently, "do consider, if the note says 4 o'clock and the watch says 12:10, then either Mr. Fletcher expected to be here alive at 4, or someone wanted us to believe he did. In either case, someone knew our tea would provide a ready audience." Slack's mouth tightened. "And the someone," he said, "was likely amongst us when the note was written." "Or when it was placed," Miss Marple returned, "which is not quite the same thing." They looked then, all of them, not at the body, but at each other, the way villagers do when the ordinary veil of life has been drawn aside, and each face is slightly altered by the possibility that it could, under certain conditions, be the face of a killer. In that faintly charged silence, Miss Marple saw two things not strictly meant for her. Irene West's hand, which had been steady, tremble for an instant before she folded it into the other, and Lionel Peake glance, swiftly, guiltily, toward the path behind the church, as if remembering a duty undone or a secret left exposed. "It grows chilly," said Miss Marple softly, for the air under the willow had shifted. "One should fetch shawls." And in that homely suggestion lay, as often with her, the neatest of traps. For people, when offered comfort, reveal themselves in the manner of their acceptance. She watched, knitting needles forgotten, as Griselda sent for wraps, and the crowd, rearranged by the movement, altered its patterns. Someone would step into a print that had been waiting for their foot, and she would be there to see it. The air had that unsettled quality peculiar to late summer afternoons in the countryside. Still warm enough for bees to drift lazily over the flower beds, yet touched with a faint, creeping coolness that hinted at the day's decline. The crowd in the vicarage garden, gathered now in smaller knots, had begun to murmur in the low tones of those reluctant to go, but unwilling to be thought ghoulish. Slack's constables moved among them with notebooks, their steady queries serving as a reminder that this was no ordinary village gathering. Miss Marple had accepted a shawl from Griselda with polite gratitude, though the chills she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. She had learned long ago that in the wake of a violent death, people's patterns shifted. Friendships stretched or snapped. small vanities withered, and certain truths that might have lain dormant for years rose suddenly to the surface. The trick was not to push too hard, but to allow those truths to emerge, coaxed by the appearance of harmless conversation. She found herself near Mrs. Bantry, who was pouring lukewarm tea into mismatched cups for a cluster of ladies. "Of course," Mrs. Bantry was saying, "I never trusted that man." "Oh, polite enough, and one can't fault his manners. But there was something about the way he looked at you, as though he were assessing what you were worth in pounds and shillings. I always say a solicitor should be discreet, not appraising." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes following Lionel Peake across the lawn. He was speaking to Sergeant Lake, gesturing toward the side gate as if explaining some errand that had taken him out of sight earlier in the day. His boots were clean now. She noticed a smear of damp earth along the instep that was not there before, which suggested he had been somewhere muddy quite recently. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice. Irene West's hand shook just now. I saw it when she adjusted her hat. She's usually composed, that one. If she's nervous, it's because she's hiding something. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, though sometimes people are nervous simply because they are being watched. She did not add that Irene's tremor had coincided exactly with the moment Sergeant Lake had returned holding the parish mallet. Such details were better kept for the right moment. Slack, meanwhile, had gathered his primary suspects, Peake, Trent, and Irene, under the awning for a second round of questions. His voice carried in bursts, interspersed with the scratch of a constable's pencil. "You say you were by the north hedge from 11:30 until just before noon?" he asked Irene. "Yes," she replied firmly. "The bunting kept catching in the branches, and I had to fetch a stool from the church hall." "Anyone see you fetch it?" "I believe Mrs. Sims did. She was arranging the cake table by the hall door." Slack made a note. "And you didn't pass near the Willow?" "No." Irene's voice was steady again, but her fingers tightened on the strap of her handbag. Miss Marple moved a few steps nearer, appearing to be absorbed in retying her shawl. She caught the faintest scent of lavender sachet from Irene's handbag. A detail of no consequence, perhaps, except that it masked another scent, sharper and more metallic, which vanished almost as soon as it was noticed. When Slack dismissed the group, Peake was the first to stride away, his shoulders hunched. Trent lingered, speaking earnestly to the vicar about the importance of order in parish records. Irene, after a quick glance toward Miss Marple, crossed the lawn to stand beside Griselda, who greeted her kindly. Miss Marple saw the schoolmistress's relief at this small alliance. Griselda was the sort who calmed suspicion simply by standing near. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple with a look that was half curiosity, half challenge. "You've been watching like a cat at a mouse hole. What's your sense of it?" "Oh, I hardly know," Miss Marple said, eyes still scanning the lawn. "But I do think Mr. Fletcher was not killed here. He was too tidy a man to arrange himself in such an undignified position, and the grass beneath him shows no sign of struggle. No broken stems, no scattered leaves. One might say he was set down gently." "Moved after death, then?" Haydock asked. "Yes, and perhaps not by the person who struck the blow." This caught Haydock's attention. "Two people, one to kill, another to move?" "It is possible. Or perhaps the killer was interrupted and chose the Willow because it was both near and certain to draw attention in due course." At that moment, Sergeant Lake returned from the side lane. He spoke quietly to Slack, but the inspector's raised voice carried the gist. A witness saw Mr. Peake walking toward the meadow path just after noon, carrying something wrapped in sacking. said it was the length of his arm, maybe heavier than a tool. Peake, confronted, scowled. That was a length of timber I'd been saving in my shed. Needed it for the church hall repairs. Thought I'd get it cut before tea. Where is it now? Slack demanded. In the shed, where I left it. Lake went to verify, returning 10 minutes later to report that no such timber could be found. Miss Marple did not allow her face to change, but inwardly she was filing this alongside the damp smear on Peake's boot and the fact that the meadow path skirted the edge of the old mill pond. Muddy banks in August, treacherous if one stepped too close. If something had been disposed of there, it would not be easy to retrieve. The murmur of voices stilled as a constable approached, carrying a flat, oilskin-wrapped object. Found this in the church hall loft, sir, he told Slack. The inspector unwrapped it to reveal a long, narrow ledger, its leather covered damp along one edge, as if from recent contact with water. Inside, the pages were covered in Mr. Fletcher's neat, precise hand. Several sheets near the back were marked with small crosses in red ink. Trent, leaning forward, frowned. That's not a parish book. No, Miss Marple said softly. But it might be a record of accounts, private ones. And if some of those accounts were inconvenient to the people mentioned, one could see why Mr. Fletcher might have been silenced. Slack began reading aloud some of the names in the ledger. Several belonged to villagers standing not far away. The air thickened. People shifted uncomfortably, as though a sudden cloud had passed over the sun. It was Mrs. Price Ridley who broke the silence. He kept everything, she said, her voice sharp. Every slight, every debt, every whispered confidence turned into ink. I told you he was not a man to be trusted. Miss Marple thought that was not quite true. Mr. Fletcher had been trustworthy in his own way. He trusted his records to speak for him, and he trusted that people's fear of exposure would keep them in line. It was, in its way, a dangerous sort of trust. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the willow across the grass, Slack announced that the body would be removed to Dr. Haydock's surgery for further examination. The crowd began to thin, those not directly involved slipping away with murmured excuses. Miss Marple remained near the willow, watching the constables lift the stretcher. Her eyes followed the line of flattened grass that led from the tree toward the side lane, a faint track almost lost in the growing shade. Griselda came to stand beside her. "It's dreadful, isn't it?" she said softly. "To think it happened here during the tea." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "And to think it was planned to happen in such a way. That is what troubles me most." They watched in silence for a moment longer. Then Miss Marple stooped, as if adjusting her shoe, and plucked something from the grass. A small, broken button of dark horn, its surface scratched. She slipped it into her reticule without comment. She had seen, not an hour earlier, that Lionel Peake's waistcoat was missing just such a button. The garden was quieter now, emptied of most of the curious onlookers who had lingered too long over cooling tea and stale gossip. Only those required to remain for questioning were still scattered across the lawn, their conversations hushed and eyes watchful. The willow, relieved of its grim burden, swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches whispering faintly against one another, as if recounting the day's events. The lowering sun sent amber light spilling across the church's stone walls, gilding the scene with a false warmth that did nothing to dispel the tension in the air. Miss Marple sat once more in her wicker chair, knitting in her lap, though her needles were still. She often found that stillness made people talk more freely. They mistook her silence for disengagement and, in their relief at filling it, revealed far more than they intended. From where she sat, She could hear both the low rumble of Inspector Slack's voice near the church hall and the intermittent footsteps of Sergeant Lake as he moved between the remaining suspects. Lionel Peake was the first to break from Slack's questioning and stalk across the lawn toward the gate. Slack's voice called him back sharply. "Not so fast, Peake. You'll stay until we're finished." Peake turned with obvious reluctance, muttering something about wasted time. His broad shoulders were tense, and Miss Marple noticed again that the lower hem of his waistcoat gaped slightly, where the missing button should have been. He made no attempt to conceal it, perhaps hoping that indifference would pass for innocence. A few yards away, Irene West stood by the tea table, her hat removed now, the late sun catching the copper glints in her hair. She was speaking to Griselda, her voice low and urgent, but her eyes flickered often toward the church hall, as though she expected someone or something to emerge. Every so often she smoothed the front of her skirt, a gesture too frequent to be unconscious. Oswald Trent, in contrast, appeared almost serene. He was seated on a bench near the rose beds, leafing through a small notebook with slow deliberation. His neat, deliberate movements suggested either a man entirely at ease with his conscience or one determined to appear so. He glanced occasionally toward Slack with the faintest hint of satisfaction, as though confident that his alibi was beyond reproach. Miss Marple's attention returned to Peake when Sergeant Lake approached him with a quiet but firm request. "We'll need your waistcoat, sir, for examination. The inspector thinks it may help." Peake's face darkened, but he complied, unfastening it with jerky movements before handing it over. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the faint dusting of something greenish along the fabric near the missing buttonhole. No more than a smear, easily overlooked by a less careful observer. Slack, examining the waistcoat, raised an eyebrow. "Parish green paint?" he said flatly. "Same as the mallet." Peake's jaw tightened. That paint gets everywhere. Anyone who's handled the hall equipment's got it on them. "Perhaps," Slack conceded, "but not everyone's missing a button that might just match the one found near the Willow." Miss Marple's knitting resumed at last, the soft click of the needles oddly soothing in the charged silence. She knew better than to interrupt Slack when he was pressing a point, though she suspected his focus was narrowing too soon. Peake was certainly involved. His lies about the timber and the smear of paint suggested as much. But there was a difference between involvement and guilt. While Slack continued with Peake, Miss Marple rose quietly and made her way toward the church hall. The door stood open, the scent of wood polish and old hymn books drifting out. Inside, the hall was dim and cool, the polished floors scuffed from the day's preparations. Along one wall stood the trestle tables that had held the raffle prizes earlier. She noted the numbered tickets still pinned to some of them, a few curling at the corners. The space felt oddly abandoned, as if the bustle of the morning had drained away, leaving only the faint echo of voices. In the corner, near the cupboard where the mallet and other equipment were stored, Miss Marple's eye caught on a small, folded square of paper lying half-hidden beneath a coil of bunting. She stooped and retrieved it, unfolding the creases with care. Inside was a hastily scrawled note in an unfamiliar hand. "Meet me at the Willow at 4. Urgent." The writing was more hurried than the precise, deliberate script in Fletcher's ledger, different altogether. She considered it for a long moment, then slipped it into her reticule with the button. As she stepped back into the garden, she heard raised voices. Peake's, thick with resentment, and Slack's, clipped with authority. "I told you. I've nothing to do with Fletcher's death. I didn't even like the man, but I wouldn't kill him." "And yet," Slack retorted, "you had means, opportunity. and no satisfactory account for your time between noon and tea. Miss Marple, reaching the fringe of the conversation, intervened gently. "Inspector, if I might, it's only that I was thinking of the note you found on Mr. Fletcher, the one with the time written. If Mr. Fletcher truly expected to be at the Willow at 4, why would someone need to write him another note with the same time? Unless, of course, the second note was for someone else entirely." Slack turned to her with a frown. "You've seen another note?" "I happened upon it in the hall just now. Quite a different hand." He took it from her and studied it, his brows drawing together. "This isn't Fletcher's writing. Could be a woman's. Small letters, slanted to the right." Miss Marple glanced discreetly toward Irene West. The schoolmistress was standing very still now, her gaze fixed on the note in Slack's hand. When Slack moved toward her, she took an involuntary step back. "It's yours, isn't it, Miss West?" Slack asked without preamble. Her lips parted, then closed again. At last she said, "Yes. I wrote it. But it's not what you think. I was asking him to meet me so we could discuss privately something he had written in that ledger, something about my aunt's estate." "And you chose the Willow?" Slack's tone was heavy with skepticism. "It was out of the way. I didn't want others to overhear." Miss Marple watched her closely. There was truth in the words, but also something held back, an omission, deliberate or otherwise, the kind of half-truth that often mattered more than the lie. "Why not speak to him earlier in the day?" Slack pressed. "I tried. He said he was busy and told me to find him later." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "And where were you between noon and 4? "I went home for a short while," Irene replied. "Then I returned to help with the bunting." "Anyone see you at home?" "Number wants to live alone." Slack made a note, but Miss Marple saw his satisfaction, too much satisfaction. He believed he had caught her in a convenient gap. And perhaps he had. But Miss Marple had learned that convenient gaps were sometimes made to be noticed, leading the eye away from the less obvious truth. As the evening deepened, the questioning wound down. The remaining villagers were told they could leave, though Slack cautioned that no one was to leave St. Mary Mead without notifying him. Irene left quickly, her head bowed, while Peake lingered just long enough to shoot a dark glance at Trent, who was still sitting serenely on his bench. Miss Marple remained in the garden a little longer, watching the last slant of sunlight fade from the willow's branches. The breeze carried the faint scent of damp earth from the side lane, mingled with the sharper tang of something metallic, perhaps from the tools in the hall, or perhaps from something else entirely. Thought of the broken button, the green smear on Peake's waistcoat, the hurried hand of Irene's note, and the ledger with its marked pages. These were pieces, yes, but pieces from different puzzles. The trick would be to see where they overlapped, where one pattern intruded upon another. Before she left, she walked once more to the Willow, crouching to examine the ground where the body had lain. The grass was already beginning to spring back, erasing the signs of its grim occupation. But near the base of the tree, half hidden among the roots, she saw a faint scratch in the bark. Fresh, the pale wood showing through. She touched it lightly. It was the height of a man's waist, perhaps made by a sharp edge catching as someone bent over. Not deliberate, but telling all the same. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her eyes on the church hall where the mallet had been kept, and then on the path that led toward the old mill pond. She had the beginning of an idea, vague, elusive, but persistent. Somewhere between the willow, the hall, and the pond lay the truth. And as she had often found, it was not always the loudest story that proved to be the right one. Dusk settled over St. Mary Mead with a softness that belied the day's events. The swallows wheeled low over the green, their wings catching the last pale ribbons of light. And the air carried the mixed scents of wood smoke and late roses. Lamps glowed in cottage windows, tiny pockets of warmth against the deepening blue. Yet for all the village's picturesque calm, there was a current beneath it now, an almost tangible watchfulness. Miss Marple, walking at an unhurried pace along the lane toward her cottage, felt it in the way curtains twitched as she passed, in the sudden silences that fell when footsteps approached. People were already rearranging their recollections, as they always did after a murder, sifting their memories for anything that might be useful, or anything that might be better forgotten. Her own thoughts were orderly, as her knitting basket always was, each detail tucked neatly beside the next. The broken horn button, the smear of Parish green on Lionel Peake's waistcoat, the hurried scrawl of Irene West's note and its curious duplication of the meeting time already found on Fletcher's person, the damp-edged ledger with its tidy red crosses, the fresh scratch on the willow's bark. She was not yet certain how these threads connected, but she was sure they were all part of the same cloth. Reaching her garden gate, she paused. There, on the low wall by the privet hedge, sat young Tom Cottle, a delivery boy from the post office. His bicycle leaned against the wall, and he was swinging one leg idly as if waiting for someone. "Evening, Tom," Miss Marple greeted him. "Out rather late for your rounds, aren't you?" Tom flushed, ducking his head. "Evening, miss. Well, I had something I thought might be important. Only I didn't know if I should tell the inspector or not." Miss Marple's tone was gently encouraging. "Perhaps you could tell me first, and we shall see." Tom glanced around as though fearing to be overheard. "It was just after 12, miss, maybe a bit past, when I was cycling back from delivering to Mrs. Ellis at the mill house. I came up the meadow path, and I saw Mr. Peake. He was carrying something long, all wrapped in sacking. I waved, but he didn't wave back, just sort of ducked his head and went toward the pond. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it till I heard about Mr. Fletcher." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "You did quite right to remember it, Tom. You say he went toward the pond. Did you see him come back?" "No, miss. I'd already gone on by then." She thanked him, promised to pass it on if it seemed useful, and watched him pedal away. The picture was becoming clearer in some ways, and murkier in others. If Peake had indeed disposed of something in the pond, it might be the timber he claimed to have been carrying, or it might be something far more incriminating. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and sat at her small writing desk. She penned a short note to Inspector Slack requesting a word first thing in the morning about a matter of some significance. Then, lighting her lamp, she returned to her chair by the hearth, though her hands remained idle. Across the village, at the Red Hart public house, Lionel Peake sat hunched over a pint, his gaze fixed on the dark surface of the beer as though it might offer answers. 2 tables away, Oswald Trent nursed a half-glass of sherry, his manner studiously unconcerned. Irene West was nowhere to be seen. She had gone home immediately after leaving the vicarage garden, and her windows remained dark. Dr. Haydock, on his evening rounds, stopped in to check on Mrs. Bantry's rheumatism and was rewarded with a brisk account of every remark made that afternoon, carefully embroidered with her own theories. He listened with polite patience, though his mind, like Miss Marple's, was on the timing. A man dead before 12:30, a note for 4 o'clock, and 2 separate summonses to the same place. One in his own hand, one in another's. It suggested either an appointment that had been known to more than one person, or an appointment that had been appropriated by someone with a darker purpose. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple finally allowed herself a small pot of tea and a slice of seed cake. She thought of Mr. Fletcher's habit of keeping meticulous records. Men like him often wielded information as others might wield a weapon. And like a weapon, such information could be stolen, hidden, or destroyed. The ledger found in the loft had clearly been concealed. But by whom? Not by Fletcher himself. She felt certain. He would have kept it close, even in a locked drawer. No, someone had removed it from his keeping before he died. The scrape on the willow's bark came back to her then, unbidden. Waist height, fresh, as though a hard edge had struck or scraped while bending over. A mallet handle? Or perhaps the edge of a ledger being hastily shoved under an arm. If Fletcher had been struck elsewhere and carried to the willow, the person moving him might have carried something else at the same time. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Irene West standing on the step, her face pale in the lamplight. "Miss Marple, I know it's late, but I didn't know who else to speak to." "Come in, my dear." Miss Marple led her to the armchair opposite and poured her tea. "Now, what troubles you?" Irene sat, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's about the note I wrote to Mr. Fletcher. I told Inspector Slack it was about my aunt's estate, and that's true. But it wasn't the whole truth. There was something else. Mr. Fletcher had written to me last week saying he'd found irregularities in another matter entirely. Something to do with the parish accounts. He wouldn't say more in the letter. He asked me to meet him, but I didn't reply until this morning when I slipped him that note at the post office. And you arranged to meet at 4 under the willow," Miss Marple prompted. "Yes. But when I arrived for the tea, I saw him speaking to Lionel Peake near the church hall. They were standing very close, and Mr. Fletcher was holding the ledger. Peake looked angry. I couldn't hear the words, but Peake gestured toward the side lane, and they walked away together. That was the last I saw of Mr. Fletcher alive." Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "And you didn't mention this to Inspector Slack?" "I was afraid," Irene admitted in a whisper. "If Peake did kill him, I didn't want him to know I'd seen them together. He's a big man, Miss Marple, and he's not gentle." Miss Marple covered the younger woman's hand with her own. "You were wise to be cautious, but the truth has a way of coming out, whether we speak it or not. And sometimes it comes out at the most inconvenient moment." After Irene had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in the quiet, piecing the day's events together in her mind. Fletcher alive at the post office before 11, later seen with Peake near the hall, carrying the ledger. By 12:10, his watch had stopped, likely at the moment of the blow. His body was under the willow by 4, accompanied by 2 notes calling him there, and a ledger hidden in the hall loft. The parish mallet bore traces of fresh cleaning, and Peake had been seen heading toward the pond with something long and heavy in sacking. It was a neat little chain of circumstances, too neat, perhaps. Miss Marple had learned to distrust cases where the pieces fit together too tidily. Such patterns were often arranged for the benefit of the onlooker. She thought of Oswald Trent, sitting so serenely with his sherry while suspicion pooled around Peake and Irene. Trent, with his meticulous record-keeping, his proximity to the parish accounts, and his presence in the vestry at precisely the right time to furnish a perfect alibi. A man who knew the value of an unimpeachable timetable might also know how to arrange one. Somewhere in all of this, she felt, lay a quiet, deliberate hand guiding events, a hand that had counted on Lionel Peake's temper and Irene West's nervousness to draw the inspector's attention. The real question was whether that hand had also wielded the mallet, or merely arranged for someone else to be caught holding it. As the clock on her mantel struck 10, Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains. The village outside was still now, the only sound the faint rush of the breeze in the trees. She banked the fire, set her teacup in the sink, and carried her knitting upstairs. Tomorrow, she thought, she would visit the mill pond. There were some questions best answered not by people, but by the things they had tried to hide. The next morning dawned pale and cool, a thin mist drifting over the fields beyond St. Mary Mead. The air had that damp, earthy smell that comes after a night of light rain, and the hedgerows glistened faintly with dew. Miss Marple, well wrapped in her gray shawl, stepped out of her cottage just after 8, her straw hat tied firmly beneath her chin. She carried with her a small walking stick, not so much for support as for the occasional gentle prod into places one's hands might hesitate to explore. The lane was quiet save for the distant clink of pails from the dairy and the muffled clatter of a cart passing along the high road. She took the familiar path toward the old mill pond, skirting the meadow where sheep grazed lazily, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. It was a path worn by decades of feet, but in places narrowed to little more than a track between tall grass. She moved unhurriedly, pausing now and then to note the small signs that others might overlook. A broken stem here, a scuffed patch of earth there, the faint trace of a footprint pressed into softer soil. When she reached the pond, the mist still lay low over the water, veiling the surface in a thin silver sheen. A few ducks stirred restlessly near the reeds, their movements sending out ripples that made the reflection of the old mill shimmer and break. The banks, churned by decades of use, were muddy near the edges, but drier further up where the grass took firmer hold. Miss Marple's eyes fell at once on a shallow indentation in the bank, about the length of a man's forearm, as though something heavy had rested there before being pushed into the water. She crouched, prodding the mud lightly with her stick. The mark was recent. The rain had softened it, but not yet erased it entirely. A few inches away lay a length of coarse sacking, its edge frayed and stained with greenish smears. Paint, she thought, very like the parish green of the mallet and Peake's waistcoat. Looking for frogs, Miss Marple? She straightened to see Dr. Haydock standing a little way off, his hands in his pockets, his face creased in a faint smile. Not this morning, she replied, though I dare say the pond has its fair share. I was thinking more of heavier creatures, those that don't swim. Haydock stepped closer, his eyes following hers to the indentation in the mud. Uh-huh. You think Peake dropped something here? I think, said Miss Marple mildly, that something was placed here before being consigned to the water. And I think that something might answer one or two questions if it were to be recovered. Haydock frowned at the pond. It's deep in the middle. You'd need a rake or a drag to bring up anything that's sunk. And it's not exactly pleasant work. I imagine Inspector Slack could arrange for someone with the necessary equipment, she said, as if the idea had only just occurred to her. After all, it might be part of his missing timber or something rather more interesting. By mid-morning, Slack arrived at the pond with Sergeant Lake and 2 constables, one of whom had brought a long-handled rake and a weighted hook on a rope. Miss Marple stood back, watching as they began to probe the murky water near the indentation. Twice the hook caught on nothing but weeds, coming up draped in green strands that dripped back into the pond. On the 3rd attempt, there was a dull scrape against something solid, followed by a slow, sucking pull as the object broke free of the mud. When it emerged, dripping and slick, It proved to be a long, narrow wooden case about the size of a carpenter's toolbox. The sacking Miss Marple had found matched the patches still clinging to its sides. The case was locked, but the lock had rusted enough for Slack to force it open with a screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a heavy hammer, blunt-headed with a smear of green paint along the shaft. And beneath it, a bundle of papers tied with string. Slack unwrapped the papers first, frowning as he scanned the pages. These are more of Fletcher's records. Not just accounts, letters, deeds, even a few affidavits. Looks like he kept copies of everything. Miss Marple took in the hammer with a calm glance. Not the parish mallet, she observed, but capable of delivering a similar blow, and with the same unfortunate shade of green on the handle. Slack grunted. If this is what Peake was carrying, it's damning enough. Miss Marple's eyes drifted back to the papers. It is also possible, she said quietly, that whoever placed these here intended both the weapon and the documents to disappear together. But one wonders, if these papers are as sensitive as they appear, why they were not burned instead. Water is far less certain. Slack gave her a sharp look. You're suggesting the person who hid them wanted them found? Not necessarily found, Miss Marple said, but perhaps retrievable at some later time by someone who knew exactly where to look. By the time they returned to the village, the news had already begun to spread. Mrs. Bantry intercepted Miss Marple near the green, demanding every detail, and was scandalized to hear of the papers. Why, if half the village's affairs are in there, no one's safe. It's like a powder keg, Mary. It only takes a spark. Miss Marple agreed, though she suspected the spark had already been struck. That afternoon, at Slack's request, the three principal figures, Peake, Irene West, and Oswald Trent, were brought to the church hall for further questioning. Miss Marple, unobtrusively seated at the back, knitted with the serene air of someone entirely absorbed in her pattern. Slack began with Peake. You were seen carrying a sacked object toward the pond just after noon yesterday. We've now recovered that object. Would you care to explain? Peake's face flushed a deep red. I told you, I was taking timber for the hall repairs. Slack laid the wet wooden case on the table between them. Timber doesn't usually come with a hammer and a bundle of incriminating papers, Mr. Peake. Peake stared at the case, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment. I've never seen that before. Someone's setting me up. Convenient, Slack said dryly. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to Trent, who was watching the exchange with polite interest, as though attending a lecture on a mildly diverting subject. His notebook lay closed on his knee, but one hand rested on it, as if ready to record something at any moment. When Irene was questioned, she admitted again to arranging the meeting with Fletcher, but denied knowing anything about the hammer or the papers. Her gaze flicked once toward Trent as she spoke, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting expression there. Not guilt, exactly, but something closer to apprehension. Finally, Slack turned to Trent. You were in the vestry from 11:45 to 12:30. Anyone else pass through? Only the vicar, Trent replied. I was engaged in counting the offertory. You may ask him. He will confirm it. Yes, you've a very good alibi, Slack said. Almost too good. Trent smiled faintly. One can hardly choose the timing of church duties, Inspector. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, then resumed their quiet clicking. She thought of something her father had once told her, that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in truth so thickly that no one dares to peel them apart. Trent's alibi was sound, yes, but it also covered only a narrow window. If the blow had been struck just after 12:10, and if someone else had moved Fletcher's body later. She rose quietly before the questioning was over, slipping out into the cool air. The vicarage garden was empty now, the willow casting long shadows across the lawn. She walked to the tree, placing her hand lightly on the bark where the fresh scratch had been. From here, one could see the path to the church hall, the side lane, and, if one leaned slightly, the beginning of the meadow path toward the pond. Yes, she thought. It was not so much a question of who had struck the blow, but of who had arranged the stage so neatly that the wrong person would take the bow. And if she was right, the curtain was only just beginning to rise. The afternoon light was thinning, turning the stone walls of St. Mary Mead a gentle gold as Miss Marple made her way back from the church hall to her cottage. The village had that watchful, suspended quality it often took on in the wake of a crime. Everyone was going about their business, but in a more deliberate fashion, as though aware that each movement might be observed. A milk churn was being rolled to a doorstep. A cat slunk along a low wall, and in the distance, the faint, rhythmic thump of a carpet beater carried on the breeze. She paused outside the gate to her garden, not because she was tired, but because she could feel the threads of the matter settling in her mind. There were 3 names spoken most often now: Peake, Irene West, Trent, and each of them was being fitted into a narrative by the villagers with an enthusiasm untroubled by proof. But Miss Marple, who knew how often a story most readily believed was the one most carefully constructed, could not quite fit those names neatly into the picture she carried in her head. After a solitary supper of soup and bread, she took out her small notebook, a habit she maintained, though she never allowed the inspector to see it. In neat, slanted handwriting, she made a column for each of the 3. Peake, seen with Fletcher near the hall, waistcoat with green smear, missing button, trip to pond with sacked object, temper. Irene, wrote note to Fletcher, arranged meeting, seen watching Trent during questioning, fear of Peake. Trent, alibi and vestry, proximity to parish accounts, calm throughout, possible motive if ledger contents damaging. Beneath these she added a separate list: broken horn button, scratch on willow, 2 notes for same meeting, damp ledger in hall loft, hammer and papers in pond. Then she set down her pen and looked at the lists for a long time. The important thing, she told herself, was not to ask, which of these is the clue, but rather, which of these has been placed for me to see. The next morning, she made a small detour on her way to the grocer and found herself in the narrow passage that ran between the church hall and the vestry. It was little used except by those involved in church business. And at this hour, the only sound was the faint ticking of the hall's old clock. She let her eyes drift along the wall until they settled on a small scuff near the doorframe. Fresh, pale against the older wood. It was the kind of mark that might be made by the edge of a box or a case being carried in haste. A voice behind her made her turn. "Miss Marple, I thought that was you." It was Irene West, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I've just been to the post office." Miss Marple smiled. "Errands are always better done early, I think. Less bustle. I wonder, my dear. Do you recall if Mr. Fletcher carried anything with him yesterday morning, apart from the ledger you mentioned?" Irene hesitated. "Now that you mention it, yes. When I saw him with Peake, he also had a smaller case under his arm, dark wood with brass corners. I assumed it was another set of documents. But when I looked again, it was gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you didn't mention this to Inspector Slack?" "I didn't think it important." Everyone was focused on the ledger. They parted soon after, but Miss Marple walked on toward the grocer with the image of that dark wooden case in her mind. It matched exactly the one recovered from the pond. And if Irene had seen it with Fletcher before noon, then Peake must have come into possession of it somehow. But was it by force, or was it handed over? By the time she returned home, a note had been pushed through her letterbox in a plain envelope. The handwriting was small and angular, the message brief. Meet me at the churchyard bench after evensong. I have information. It was unsigned. At evensong, the small congregation filed out into the cool evening air. Miss Marple lingered by the porch until the others had gone, then made her way to the bench beneath the yew trees. There, already seated, was Oswald Trent. I hope you don't mind the method, he said smoothly, but some things are best discussed away from the inspector's ears. Miss Marple settled beside him, her expression mild. You have information? Perhaps, or perhaps only a perspective. He folded his hands over his knee. Mr. Fletcher was a man who liked to keep others at a disadvantage. His records gave him that power. But what few people know is that he had recently discovered an anomaly in the sale of the old rectory. Money unaccounted for, signatures not quite matching. Oh, nothing that would stand up in court without further proof. But enough to ruin a man's standing if it became public. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. And whose standing might that have been? Trent's eyes were steady. Peake acted as the intermediary in that sale. I've no proof he did anything improper, but Fletcher was preparing to confront him. If Peake believed Fletcher meant to expose him, well, perhaps you see the rest? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It is a convincing chain of reasoning. When they parted, Trent walking toward the village and Miss Marple toward her cottage, she allowed herself a small, wry smile. Trent's perspective was indeed convincing, too convincing. It neatly arranged the facts so that every path led to Peake, and it came from a man whose own connection to the parish accounts might bear scrutiny. It was exactly the sort of story one might plant to ensure the wrong conclusion was reached. The following morning, Slack called at her cottage. We've enough to bring Peake in, he announced without preamble. The hammer, the case, the smear of paint, the witness seeing him at the pond, it's more than enough. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, pouring him tea. Though, I wonder, if Peake truly wished to hide the case, why not wait it so it would sink beyond hope of recovery? He's a practical man, after all. Slack frowned. What are you getting at? Only that someone who hides something in water without making sure it stays hidden might be less concerned with concealment than with misdirection, like leaving a trail that is meant to be found. Slack drank his tea in silence, clearly unwilling to be drawn further. But Miss Marple could tell her words had left a small seed in his mind. That afternoon she took another walk, this time to the vicarage garden. The willow stood as it had before, graceful and unassuming, its branches sweeping the grass. She examined the scratch on its trunk again, noting the faint brownish smear along one edge. Mud, likely from the pond bank. The person who had moved Fletcher's body here had either come from the pond or carried something from it. And then she saw it, half buried in the grass where the stretcher had rested the day before. A fragment of red twine, the kind used to tie the bundle of papers in the wooden case. It was frayed at one end, as if broken in haste. She picked it up delicately, turning it over in her fingers. If the papers had been in the case when it went into the pond, How had a piece of their binding come to be under the willow before the case was recovered? Unless, of course, the papers had been removed from Fletcher before his body was placed there, and only later reunited with the case for their watery hiding place. She slipped the twine into her reticule and stood for a moment longer beneath the willow, her gaze on the path that led toward the hall. She thought of the scuff mark near the vestry door, the calm certainty in Trent's manner, the too neat trail to peak. The hand that had arranged this had done so with care, and with an understanding of how people, villagers, inspectors, even witnesses, tended to follow the most obvious line. But the most obvious line was rarely the truest one. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching people hide their sins in plain sight, was beginning to see where the line bent. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a call on Oswald Trent, at a time when he did not expect her, and when he might be in the midst of something he preferred to keep unseen. That, in her experience, was often the moment when a person told you the most, without saying a word at all. The following morning was brighter than the last, the early mist already burned away by a sun that promised warmth later in the day. St. Mary Mead was stirring to life. The clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps, the creak of shop shutters being raised, and the occasional hum of voices from the green where Mrs. Bantry was already gathering a few of her friends for what was certain to become a vigorous discussion of the whole sorry business. Miss Marple, however, had no time for gossip that morning. She had dressed with particular care, neither too formally nor too casually, and set out along the lane toward Oswald Trent's cottage. She did not intend to announce her visit. The element of surprise was a valuable tool when one wished to see people in their unarranged state. Trent's cottage was tucked away on a side path, a modest building with neatly kept borders of geraniums and lavender. As she approached, Miss Marple could hear a faint rustling from within and the unmistakable sound of papers being shuffled. The front door stood ajar. She tapped lightly. "Mr. Trenta, are you receiving visitors?" There was the briefest pause before his voice floated back, smooth as ever. "Miss Marple, how very unexpected. Do come in." She stepped into the narrow hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. Trent was standing beside a small table on which lay an open ledger, not the parish one, but similar in style, and several loose sheets of paper. He closed the ledger at once, with a practiced air of harmlessness. "You find me in the midst of rather dull paperwork," he said. "Accounts for the church bazaar." "Ah," said Miss Marple mildly. "So many small sums to be made to add up neatly. I've always thought those the most troublesome." He smiled faintly. "Indeed. But I manage." He gestured toward a chair. "Tea? Or perhaps you prefer coffee?" "Tea would be most welcome." While he went to the small kitchen, she allowed her gaze to drift over the room. It was very orderly. Too orderly, perhaps. The desk in the corner held a row of labeled folders, the spines uniformly aligned. On a side table was a small wooden box with brass corners, not unlike the case recovered from the pond, but smaller, more suited to personal papers. The faintest trace of mud marked the rug near the back door, though it had been brushed at, as if someone had tried to remove it without entirely succeeding. Trent returned with the tea, pouring it with practiced ease. "I hear Inspector Slack is preparing to charge Mr. Peake," he remarked, handing her a cup. "Yes," said Miss Marple, accepting it. "He seems quite convinced." "And you?" Trent's eyes held hers over the rim of his cup. "Oh, I never like to be too sure too soon," she said with a small smile. People can be very obliging in leading one to conclusions, especially if those conclusions are convenient to them. For the briefest instant, his gaze flickered, and she saw something there. Amusement, perhaps, or the faintest recognition of a shared understanding. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm politeness. They spoke of village matters for a few minutes more before Miss Marple rose to leave. "You've been very kind," she said. "I mustn't take up your time when you have so many accounts to settle." Once outside, she walked back toward the green at a steady pace, turning over the visit in her mind. She had not caught him in any overt falsehood, but she had seen enough. The quick concealment of the ledger, the mud by the back door, the careful order of his papers. Trent was a man who liked things arranged exactly so, both in his home and, she suspected, in the events surrounding Fletcher's death. She had almost reached her own gate when she was intercepted by Irene West, who looked pale and agitated. "Miss Marple, may I speak to you? It's about yesterday." "Of course, my dear." Irene glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. "I've remembered something. When I was in the hall loft on the morning of the tea, fetching extra bunting, I saw Mr. Trent come up. He said he was looking for some old records, but I noticed he had the parish mallet with him. He was wiping it with a cloth. At the time, I thought nothing of it. He's so involved in parish work. But now, with everything that's happened..." She broke off, twisting her hands together. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "That is a most interesting recollection. And you're quite certain it was before the tea began?" "Yes. It must have been around 11:30. When Irene had gone, Miss Marple stood for a moment in thought. If Trent had the mallet before noon, he had the opportunity to strike the blow himself. His alibi in the vestry could still hold if Fletcher had been attacked earlier and the watch stopped later, or if the time of death was less precise than assumed. The mallet, the ledger, the planted case in the pond. It was all beginning to weave into a pattern that was less about Peake's guilt and more about Trent's careful stage setting. She spent the rest of the afternoon quietly visiting one or two other villagers, always under some pretext, gathering small scraps of observation. That Trent had been seen near the side lane around 12:30. That Peake had been drinking in the Red Hart shortly after 1. That Irene had returned home for a short while between her work on the bunting and the start of the tea. By early evening, Miss Marple had the shape of it. Fletcher had uncovered something, likely in the parish accounts, that implicated Trent. He had arranged to meet someone at the Willow at 4. But Trent, knowing of this, had acted first. The mallet had been in his possession before noon. Fletcher had been lured or cornered somewhere out of sight, struck, and the watch stopped to mislead. The body was then placed under the Willow to coincide with the tea, ensuring maximum attention and gossip. The case and papers had been hidden in the pond, not to vanish forever, but to be recovered later by Trent when suspicion had settled firmly on Peake. The next step, she knew, was delicate. To confront Trent outright would yield nothing. He was too controlled. Instead, she would need to place him in a position where his own careful arrangements might betray him. She went to bed early that night, her plan forming as she drifted into sleep. Tomorrow, she would speak to Inspector Slack, not to insist on Trent's guilt, but to propose a small, harmless-sounding test. A test that, if she was correct, would make Oswald Trent show his hand without even realizing he had done so. And when that moment came, she thought with the faintest smile, it would be under the Willow's trailing branches, where the whole performance had begun. The following morning broke crisp and clear, the kind of day when the air carried a faint snap that promised autumn was not far off. Miss Marple was up before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, her kettle already singing on the hob. She sipped her tea slowly, gazing out at her small back garden where the dahlias stood heavy-headed in the early light. By 9 o'clock, she had walked to the police station, a modest building with peeling paint and a smell faintly of ink and damp wool. Inspector Slack was in his office, bent over a stack of reports. He looked up with a frown when she knocked and entered. "I've come with a suggestion," she said without preamble. Slack leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "If this is about Mr. Peake again, Miss Marple, I assure you—" "Oh, not about Mr. Peake," she interrupted mildly. "In fact, quite the opposite. I think it might be wise to see whether we cannot unsettle another party." Slack's eyebrows rose. "You mean Trent?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "You have said yourself how neat the case against Mr. Peake appears. I think it a little too neat. And I believe Mr. Trent has become accustomed to arranging things so they fall just where he wishes them. A small test might reveal whether his confidence is justified." "What sort of test?" She explained in her calm, deliberate way. An announcement, ostensibly for the press, that a further search of the pond was to be carried out, this time using a new method capable of detecting metal or weighted objects deep in the silt. The key would be to suggest, in Trent's hearing, that one item from the pond, the case, was missing something when found, and that the search might yet recover it. Slack's eyes narrowed as he considered it. "You think he'll react?" "If he has reason to fear what else might be in that pond, he will not be able to help himself," she said gently. "Even the most careful people become clumsy when they believe their safety is threatened." By noon, the bait was laid. Slack had made a point of discussing the second pond search within earshot of several villagers in the high street, making sure the details would travel quickly. Word spread with the speed of a grass fire. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple took a seat on the bench near the green, her knitting in hand, knowing that from this vantage point she could see both the lane to the pond and the paths leading from the vicarage and the church hall. The village went about its business, but she kept her eyes on the comings and goings. Shortly after 3, she spotted Trent walking briskly from the direction of his cottage, a folded newspaper in his hand. He passed her with a polite nod, his expression outwardly serene. But his steps were a fraction too quick, his grip on the paper just a little too tight. He turned down the lane toward the pond. Miss Marple rose, as if simply stretching her legs, and followed at a discreet distance. The pond lay still and brown under the late afternoon sun, the surface dappled with drifting leaves. Trent stood at the water's edge, looking out over it. He glanced around, once, twice, and then crouched, taking something from his pocket. Miss Marple could not see clearly from where she stood among the willows, but she heard the soft plop as whatever it was hit the water. She let him walk back up the path before stepping forward herself. There was a faint disturbance in the surface where he had stood, a widening circle still fading. She could just make out a scrap of pale fabric clinging to the reeds, perhaps from the thing he had thrown in. That evening, Slack paid her a visit, and she recounted what she had seen. "We'll have the pond dragged again tomorrow," he said, "and I'll be the one watching him this time." The next day's search was quieter than the first, with fewer villagers loitering at the edges. After an hour, the constables brought up a sodden cloth bag weighted with 2 large stones. Inside were several sheets of paper, soaked through but still faintly legible. Even at a glance, it was clear they matched the style of the documents in Fletcher's ledger. Slack whistled. Looks like he was trying to finish the job. Miss Marple nodded. Or to remove something he feared we might find in the next search. Either way, it shows he had both knowledge of and access to those papers after Fletcher's death. That afternoon, Slack summoned Trent to the station. Miss Marple, at Slack's invitation, sat quietly in a corner of the office as the inspector began. "Mr. Trent, we recovered this from the pond this morning," Slack said, placing the sodden bag on the desk. "Would you care to explain how your handwriting came to be on one of these documents?" For the first time, Trent's composure faltered. "My handwriting? That's absurd. Anyone could have..." Slack slid a sheet across the desk. "Your figures, your initials, parish account notes. Looks like you were the one who signed off on the rectory sale." Trent's mouth tightened. "That proves nothing." "It proves you had reason to keep Fletcher from making these public," Slack countered. Miss Marple's voice, quiet but firm, carried into the pause. "It also proves, Mr. Trent, that you had possession of these papers after Mr. Fletcher died. If you had no part in his death, how did you come by them? And why risk being seen at the pond yesterday?" Trent looked at her, something cold flickering in his eyes. "You've been watching me." "Indeed," she said simply. "From the moment I realized you were the only one with both the skill to arrange the evidence so neatly and the temperament to remain calm while others quarreled. You knew suspicion would fall on Mr. Peake. His temper, his lies about the timber, the smear of paint. But you overlooked one thing. People who move bodies, hide objects, and create false trails are rarely able to resist tidying up afterwards. And it was in the tidying that you betrayed yourself." Slack leaned forward. "We can place you with the parish mallet before noon. We can show you had the papers after Fletcher's death. And we've got you at the pond trying to dump the rest. I think that's enough for the Crown to take an interest." Trent said nothing for a long moment, then gave a short, mirthless laugh. "It was supposed to be simple," he said finally. "He'd found out about the sale. He wouldn't listen to reason. I meant only to frighten him, make him drop it. But he fell when I struck him, and it was easier to let them think it was Peake." There was no heat in his voice, only a weary resignation. "I put him under the willow because everyone would be there for the tea. And Peake, well, Peake would make the perfect suspect. The man can't even walk to the pub without looking guilty." Slack signaled to Sergeant Lake, who stepped forward to take Trent into custody. When they had gone, Miss Marple sat for a moment in the quiet office, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You knew all along," Slack said, half admiring, half accusing. "Oh, not all along," she corrected gently. "Only once I saw that the obvious trail to Mr. Peake was not merely careless, but deliberate. Real life is rarely so tidy. And Mr. Trent," she added, rising, "was a very tidy man." Outside, the air was bright and cool, and the willow's branches swayed gently in the breeze. The village would return to its routine soon enough. But under the neat surface there would be, for a time, the memory of what had happened there, and of how easily a careful hand could arrange events to point the wrong way. Miss Marple walked home at her usual, unhurried pace, already thinking of her knitting and the dahlias that needed cutting. She had no doubt the talk in the Red Hart that evening would be lively, but she would leave it to others. She had seen enough of human nature, after all, to know that every tidy story left behind a few loose threads, and that sometimes those threads were better left alone. It was 2 days after Trent's arrest, and St. Mary Mead was slowly resettling into its familiar rhythm. The shock of the Willow Tree murder had not faded entirely. Such things never did in a small village. But it had begun to sink beneath the surface of daily life, where it would be drawn up again in whispers for years to come. Already the butcher's boy had taken to beginning every delivery with, "Of course, I was right there when they..." And Mrs. Bantry had found at least 3 opportunities to work the drama into conversations about entirely unrelated matters. The willow itself stood as it had before, its long green tresses trailing in the light breeze, casting dapples across the grass. There was no sign now of the grim discovery that had been made beneath its branches. The vicarage garden was once again a place of tea and croquet, though the sight of the tree drew a certain lingering glance from almost everyone who passed it. Miss Marple, however, had little interest in lingering glances. She had been up early, as was her habit, tending to her dahlias and tying back the last of the climbing beans. With the case concluded, Inspector Slack had promised to call by for a final word before the papers went to the Crown Prosecution Service. She was halfway through polishing the silver sugar tongs when his knock sounded at the door. He came in looking less harried than usual, though still with that slightly defensive air he wore in her presence. "I thought you might like to hear the last of it," he said, accepting the tea she poured. "Trent's confessed fully now. The solicitor's satisfied with the statement, and we've traced the whole business of the rectory sale. Falsified figures, forged signatures, the lot. Fletcher was on the point of making it public." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I rather thought it would be something of that nature. Mr. Trent struck me as the sort of man who prided himself on a spotless reputation, externally spotless at least. A dangerous thing, that. Pride in appearances can make people do very foolish things." Slack sipped his tea, eyeing her over the rim. "What I still don't see is how you spotted him before I did. You had your eye on Peake same as anyone at the start." "Oh, indeed," she agreed. "Peake was meant to be noticed. That was the clever part. But real cleverness leaves its own pattern, Inspector. When things line up too neatly, when every piece of evidence fits the same person without a single loose end, that is when I become suspicious. Real life is untidy. Human nature is untidy. A perfect picture is more often painted than taken." Slack grunted, though there was reluctant respect in it. "I suppose I let the tidy picture sway me." "It is a common failing," Miss Marple said, refilling his cup. "But there were other things. The 2 notes for the same meeting, for example." Why would Fletcher need both? It was clear that one was meant for someone else entirely. Someone who would be under the willow at 4 o'clock. And then there was the matter of the papers. Hiding them in water without weighting them properly was not the act of a man determined they be lost forever. It was the act of a man who wanted them hidden from others, but still retrievable by himself. Slack gave a short laugh, and then our pond search announcement flushed him out. "Yes," she said, with the smallest of smiles. "You see, Inspector, some people cannot bear to leave a matter alone once they believe it's been disturbed. It was the tidying up that betrayed him." He rose after another quarter hour, promising to send word when the trial date was set. At the door, he paused. "You know," he said, "I sometimes think you could have been a detective yourself." "Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "I'm far too fond of my garden." When he had gone, she sat quietly for a while, watching the sunlight play on the leaves outside. She knew the village would move on soon enough. There would be another wedding, another scandal, another harvest supper to occupy their tongues. But for some, the memory of the case would linger. For Irene West, it had already brought a certain change. The cloud over her name had lifted, and with it, some of the reserve she had always worn like armor. Miss Marple saw her on the green that afternoon, speaking easily with Griselda Clement and even laughing at something the vicar said. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple valued such changes. They were signs of a person loosening the grip of past hurts. Lionel Peake, too, was altered, though less pleasantly. He still walked with the air of a man ill-used by fate, muttering about how quickly people had believed him guilty. Yet Miss Marple suspected the experience might eventually temper his quick temper, if only because he had seen how near he had come to being the convenient scapegoat. As for the rest of the village, the affair had reminded them all that secrets seldom stay buried, whether in water, in paper, or in the tidy arrangements of a man like Trent. That evening, Miss Marple took her knitting into the garden. The air was soft, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the faint tang of the wood smoke from the baker's oven. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a child laughed. From the direction of the Red Hart came the muffled hum of voices. Life, as always, was moving forward. She worked in steady rhythm, the click of her needles keeping time with her thoughts. She reflected, as she often did after such events, on the curious mix of malice and vanity that lay at the heart of so many crimes. In Trent's case, it had been the need to control the narrative as much as the need to protect himself. People like that, she thought, were rather like gardeners who could not bear to see a plant grow in its own way. They must prune and shape until the thing is no longer quite natural. But nature, she knew, had a way of breaking through such designs in the end. As the light faded, she looked toward the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the vicarage garden. The willow's shape was a darker silhouette now, its long branches swaying in the twilight. For all its beauty, it would always hold a shadow for her, a reminder of how easily a place of shade and quiet could become the stage for something violent. And yet, she thought, that was human nature in a way. People imagined danger in dark alleys and distant cities, forgetting that the truest threats often came from those who lived just across the lane, who nodded to you at the grocer's, who kept the parish records in immaculate order. She set down her knitting for a moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap. In her long life, she had learned many such lessons, and one of the most important was this. Wickedness was rarely a matter of strangers. It was a matter of neighbors, of people whose habits and weaknesses you knew so well that you could almost predict them. And it was precisely that knowledge that had allowed her, time and again, to see the truth where others saw only the picture presented to them. The clock inside struck 9, a soft, homely sound. Miss Marple gathered up her knitting and went indoors, drawing the curtains against the night. She put the sugar tongs back in their place, smoothed the tablecloth, and set the kettle to boil. In the morning, there would be letters to answer, the dahlias to cut, and perhaps a call from Mrs. Bantry with some tidbit of news. Life in St. Mary Mead would resume its course, and she would resume hers. Watching, listening, and tucking away the small, seemingly unimportant details that might one day prove to be the key to another puzzle. For now, the village slept under the quiet watch of the stars, the willows swaying gently in the dark, and Miss Marple, in her neat, ordered sitting room, poured herself a cup of tea and thought, not of the crime now past, but of the endless, fascinating variety of human nature. It was, she reflected, quite enough to keep one occupied for a lifetime. The next week brought with it the comfortable routines of village life, but with a new undercurrent, an aftertaste of unease that lingered even as the days seemed to return to normal. In St. Mary Mead, nothing truly passed without leaving a trace. And the Willow Tree Murder was now woven into the tapestry of village memory. It sat there like a darker thread among the past year's fetes and harvest suppers, not to be spoken of directly too often, but always there when you looked closely. The vicarage garden, scene of so much sudden drama, was once again the venue for parish gatherings. Yet Miss Marple noticed that few people now lingered near the willow's shade for long. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she preferred more open seating for her tea, and Mr. Trent's name, when mentioned at all, was spoken in lowered tones, as though the very sound might be unlucky. Even the children, bold as they were, played their games, further up the lawn, giving the great tree a wide berth. Miss Marple herself had no such hesitation. She often passed under its trailing boughs on her way to the vicarage, pausing to note the healthy green of the leaves or to observe the way the sunlight filtered through them. She believed firmly that one must not let a place be taken over by unpleasant memories. Otherwise, the wrong sort of thing gained a hold over you. Still, she had no objection to the villagers avoiding it. They were entitled to their quiet shivers. It was during one of these visits to the vicarage, a week after Trent's arrest, that Griselda Clement pressed a small package into Miss Marple's hands. "For you," she said, with her usual bright smile. "I thought you might like to have something sweet after all that horrid business." Inside the brown paper was a tin of Griselda's famous ginger biscuits, a particular favorite of Miss Marple's. Over tea, Griselda chattered about the village sewing circle, the plans for the Christmas bazaar, and how the school children were rehearsing for a small play. Though Irene West says it will be chaos unless she's given full control. The mention of Irene prompted Miss Marple to ask, quite casually, how the schoolmistress was faring now that her name had been cleared. "Oh, much better," Griselda said, "though I think the whole thing has left her a little more guarded. She was always reserved, but now she chooses her company very carefully. I can't say I blame her. She told me she's thinking of applying for a teaching post in the next county. A fresh start, you know." Miss Marple nodded, though inwardly she thought it a pity. Irene had been wrongfully suspected, yes, but she had also shown courage in coming forward with her memories about the mallet. There was a certain strength in her that might have flourished here, had circumstances been kinder. On her way home from the vicarage, Miss Marple was hailed by Lionel Peake, who was leaning over the gate of his workshop. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Thought you'd like to know I've finished repairing the parish hall table. Though whether they'll thank me for it, I'm not sure." After all, they were ready to believe I'd brained Fletcher with a mallet. His tone was half aggrieved, half boasting, as though surviving suspicion were an achievement in itself. Miss Marple, with her customary gentleness, told him that people were quick to judge when frightened, and that he might find in time that suspicion could be lessened by a touch more patience in his dealings with others. Peake muttered something non-committal, but she thought perhaps he would remember it later. That evening, she had a letter from Inspector Slack, written in a surprisingly neat hand for such a blunt man. He enclosed a short note of thanks from the chief constable, acknowledging her observations of value in the case. Miss Marple smiled at the phrasing. It was the sort of thing officials wrote when they didn't wish to be too effusive. Still, it pleased her to know that her quiet work had been recognized, however formally. The following days brought a soft stretch of fine weather, and the village took advantage of it. Washing hung like bright sails in cottage gardens. The pub put tables outside, and the high street filled with the mingled scents of baking bread and late roses. It was during one of her walks to the post office that Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bantry, who was deep in conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley. At the sight of Miss Marple, they both brightened, though she suspected it was as much for the chance to extract further details as it was for genuine greeting. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry began. "You must tell us. How did you know it was Trent?" "I said to Henry only yesterday that you must have had some special clue." Miss Marple laughed lightly. "No special clue, my dear. Only a sense of when a story is too neat to be true. And of course, the little things. People will always tell you without meaning to where they have been and what they have done. One need only watch and listen." Mrs. Price Ridley shivered theatrically. "And to think we were all sipping tea while poor Fletcher was lying under that tree. It's enough to make one question village fetes altogether." "Not at all," Miss Marple said kindly. "It is precisely such gatherings where one learns the most about one's neighbors. Though, of course, most of what one learns is entirely harmless. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Young Tom Cottle, the post office boy who had first mentioned seeing Peek near the pond. He stood in her doorway, awkwardly turning his cap in his hands. "I just wanted to say, thanks, miss, for listening to me that day. If you hadn't, maybe they'd have kept blaming Mr. Peek." Miss Marple invited him in for a slice of seed cake and told him that truth often came from the smallest observations and from those willing to speak up, however uncertain they might be. She suspected the boy would remember that for a long time. By the week's end, the Willow Tree Murder had begun to fade into the background of village life, though not entirely. Miss Marple overheard it mentioned in the shop, where Mrs. Sims was telling the butcher's wife that it just shows you never can tell. And in the churchyard, where two gardeners debated whether Trent had planned the murder for days or acted in the heat of the moment. On Sunday, after the service, the vicar preached a short, measured homily on the dangers of pride and the value of truth. Miss Marple, listening from her pew, could not help but think how neatly those words fit the case. Pride had been Trent's undoing as surely as the mallet blow had been Fletcher's. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more past the vicarage garden. The willows swayed gently in the breeze, its branches whispering against one another. She paused beneath it, laying a hand lightly on the rough bark where the scratch still showed faintly. Life would go on here. Lawn games, teas, laughter. But for her, the tree would always be marked by what it had sheltered. She turned away at last, making her way home through the dappled lanes. In her sitting room, the kettle was soon singing, and the familiar rhythm of her knitting needles resumed. Outside, the village carried on, tidying, arranging, and going about its business much as it always had. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that beneath the tidy surfaces and well-kept hedges, human nature would always find ways to surprise her. And that, she thought with a small, satisfied smile, was quite enough to keep her eyes open. The trial, when it came, was quick by the standards of such matters. Oswald Trent's guilt had been well established by the time the jury took their seats, and the Crown's case unfolded in an orderly procession of witnesses. The constables who had recovered the case and the sodden papers from the pond, Irene West with her clear recollection of seeing Trent in the hall loft with the parish mallet, young Tom Cottle with his glimpse of Peek at the pond, and finally, Inspector Slack tying it all together. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back of the courtroom, listened without fuss. She had no need to speak. Her part in the matter had been fulfilled long before the trial began. What she watched instead was Trent himself. Still neat, still composed, but with that fixed, brittle look of a man who knows the story he has so carefully written has been overwritten by another hand. When the guilty verdict was delivered, he inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a move in a chess game that had gone against him. Back in St. Mary Mead, The verdict was met with a mixture of satisfaction and subdued dismay. Satisfaction, because justice had been served. Dismay, because one never liked to think a person so familiar, so seemingly respectable, was capable of such things. The village had not yet decided whether Trent's name would be remembered as a cautionary tale or quietly omitted from conversations. But time would make that decision for them. The willow tree stood unchanged through it all, trailing its green fingers into the cooling autumn air. The vicarage garden was now well into preparations for the harvest supper. The tent poles were up, the bunting fluttered cheerfully, and the tables had been scrubbed clean of any memory of the day Fletcher's body had been laid beneath their shade. Even so, there was an unspoken agreement that no table would be set directly under the willow that year. Miss Marple moved easily among the preparations, smiling at Griselda's insistence on more flowers for the serving tables and listening to Mrs. Bantry's elaborate plans for the raffle. Irene West, to Miss Marple's quiet pleasure, was still in the village for now. Though she spoke often of the new position she had been offered, the thought of her starting fresh elsewhere seemed a sensible one, even if the school would miss her steady hand. Lionel Peake had returned to his work in the hall, grumbling good-naturedly about the time the police had borrowed his tools for evidence. There was still some prickliness in his manner, but less than before. Perhaps the brush with suspicion had taught him, at least for a while, the value of a measured temper. Inspector Slack visited one afternoon to return a small parcel. Miss Marple's reticule, which had been taken for safekeeping after she produced the red twine from under the willow. "Never thought I'd be thanking you for a bit of string," he said with a grin. "But I will admit, you were right from the start about the story being too tidy." "It is often so," she replied. "When all the pieces fall into place too easily, it is usually because someone has arranged them." Slack shook his head, half admiring, half resigned. "Well, you won't be rid of me just yet. There's bound to be something else cropping up sooner or later." "Oh, I don't doubt it," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "There always is." The days shortened, the evenings grew cooler, and the lanes filled with the scent of wood smoke. The harvest supper came and went without incident, though not without the occasional whispered remark about how different the garden felt in the lamplight now. Life in St. Mary Mead had its way of absorbing even the most dramatic events, folding them neatly into the past while leaving just enough of them alive in memory to keep the conversation lively on quiet evenings. One such evening, Miss Marple sat by her hearth with her knitting, the fire casting a gentle glow across the room. Outside, the wind moved softly through the garden, rattling the last of the dahlias. She thought of the willow tree, its long branches swaying in the dark, and of how something so graceful could serve as the backdrop for both beauty and cruelty. She was not troubled by the thought. In her long life, she had seen enough to know that the two often lived side by side. Gardens had weeds as well as flowers. Villages had saints and sinners in equal measure, sometimes in the same person. What mattered was paying attention, truly looking and listening, without letting the neat picture distract from the truth hidden in the details. She laid her knitting aside and poured herself a final cup of tea, the familiar comfort of it grounding her in the present. Somewhere across the green, laughter drifted from the red heart, and she smiled faintly. The village was itself again, or as much as it ever had been. And she, as always, would be watching, not with suspicion, but with that patient, kindly curiosity that had served her well through so many puzzles. The autumn wind had a sharper bite now, sweeping across St. Mary Mead and stirring the fallen leaves along the lanes. The trial was behind them, the headlines fading from the county papers. Yet the village still carried that faint hum of afterthought that follows any scandal. People had resumed their errands, their teas, and their gossip. But every so often a remark would pass, half in jest, half in unease, about the business under the willow. For Miss Marple, the matter was not one she intended to dwell on for the sake of drama. Yet it remained in her mind for one reason. It had been a textbook example of what human nature will do when self-interest and pride are pricked. It was a week after Trent had been sentenced when Inspector Slack appeared at her door once more. This time without a file under his arm or the air of a man in pursuit of evidence. He had come, he said, to tie up the last loose ends. They sat in her parlor, the afternoon light slanting through the lace curtains, tea poured and seed cake on the table. Slack leaned forward. "What I've been thinking about," he began, "is how close Peake came to taking the fall. Every scrap of the evidence could be made to point at him if you didn't look too closely. That was what had me, at the start. Everything fitted too well. And I suppose it took you to see that was the very reason it couldn't be right." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Real life is a little more untidy than that, Inspector. And Mr. Trent was a man who liked things very neat indeed. He understood people's assumptions. A man with a temper is expected to do something rash. A man with a spotless reputation is expected to be above suspicion. He relied on both those beliefs." Slack nodded. "And the business with the pond. If we hadn't made that announcement about the second search, we might never have caught him going back." "Yes," she agreed. "It was his need for control that betrayed him in the end. He could not leave something unresolved, even if it meant risking himself to set it right. That is often the case with people who are used to arranging the world to their liking. They cannot bear an untidy corner." Slack leaned back with a sigh. "Well, I'll remember that next time I'm handed a perfect case." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a moment in the quiet, the ticking of the clock filling the room. She thought again of the chain of small details that had led her to Trent. Irene's sighting of him with the mallet before noon, the faint smear of mud by his back door, the scuff near the vestry, the red twine under the willow, and, most telling of all, the story that fitted too perfectly. None of them, on their own, would have been enough. But taken together, they had formed a pattern too deliberate to be natural. That evening, she took a slow walk toward the vicarage. The garden was empty, the grass still faintly damp from the afternoon's brief shower. The willow stood quietly, its branches stirring in the breeze. She stepped beneath them, looking up at the tangle of green and gold leaves, and laid her hand on the rough bark where the scratch had long since begun to weather over. The place looked just as it had before the murder. That, she knew, was the way of things. Life resuming its outward calm even after deep disturbance. But for those who had been here, the memory would always hover in the background, a reminder that beneath the surface of any seemingly peaceful scene, there could be secrets carefully arranged and hidden from view. Miss Marple did not mind that. It was part of the fascination for her. The constant interplay between the visible and the concealed, between the neat facade and the human truths it tried to mask. And she knew that, as long as she kept her eyes and ears open, she would never run out of such puzzles to solve. She turned away from the willow at last, her pace unhurried, the evening shadows stretching long across the green. The air was cool and clear, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from the cottages. Somewhere, a church bell began to chime the hour. Tomorrow, there would be more ordinary business to attend to. The dahlias to cut, a letter to write to her nephew, perhaps a visit to the sewing circle. But she would keep in mind, as she always did, that the most revealing clues often came from the smallest and most ordinary of things. And if another case should arise, well, she would be ready.